Chapter 2 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Matt Saw. Challenges. After the guests had gone, father threw himself into a chair and gave vent to roars of gargantuan laughter. Not since the death of my mother had I known him to laugh so heartily. I'll wager Dr. Hammerfield was never up against anything like it in his life, he laughed. The courtesies of ecclesiastical controversy. Did you notice how he began like a lamb? Everhard, I mean, and how quickly he became a roaring lion? He has a splendidly disciplined mind. He would have made a good scientist if his energies had been directed that way. I need scarcely say that I was deeply interested in Ernest Everhard. It was not alone what he had said and how he had said it, but it was the man himself. I had never met a man like him. I suppose that was why, in spite of my 24 years, I had not married. I liked him. I had to confess it to myself. And my like for him was founded on things beyond intellect and argument. Regardless of his bulging muscles and prize-fighter's throat, he impressed me as an ingenious boy. I felt that under the guise of an intellectual swashbuckler was a delicate and sensitive spirit. I sensed this in ways I knew not, save that they were my woman's intuitions. There was something in that clarion call of his that went to my heart. It still rang in my ears, and I felt that I should like to hear it again, and to see again that glint of laughter in his eyes that belied the impassioned seriousness of his face. And there were further reaches of vague and indeterminate feelings that stirred in me. I almost loved him then, though I am confident, had I never seen him again, that the vague feelings would have passed away, and I should easily have forgotten him. But I was not destined never to see him again. My father's newborn interest in sociology and the dinner parties he gave would not permit. Father was not a sociologist. His marriage with my mother had been very happy, and in the researches of his own science, physics, he had been very happy. But when my mother died, his own work could not fill the emptiness. At first, in a mild way, he had dabbled in philosophy. Then, becoming interested, he had drifted on into economics and sociology. He had a strong sense of justice, and he soon became fired with a passion to redress wrong. It was with gratitude that I hailed these signs of a new interest in life, though I little dreamed what the outcome would be. With the enthusiasm of a boy, he plunged excitedly into these new pursuits, regardless of whither they led him. He had been used always to the laboratory, and so it was that he turned the dining room into a sociological laboratory. Here came to dinner all sorts and conditions of men: scientists, politicians, bankers, merchants, professors, labor leaders, socialists, and anarchists. He stirred them to discussion and analyzed their thoughts of life and society. He had met Ernest shortly prior to the preacher's night, and after the guests were gone I learned how he had met him, passing down a street at night and stopping to listen to a man on a soapbox who was addressing a crowd of working men. The man on the box was Ernest. Not that he was a mere soapbox orator. He stood high in the councils of the Socialist Party, was one of the leaders, and was the acknowledged leader in the philosophy of socialism. But he had a certain clear way of stating the abstruse in simple language, was a born expositor and teacher, and was not above the soapbox as a means of interpreting economics to the working men. My father stopped to listen, became interested, effected a meeting, and, after quite an acquaintance, invited him to the minister's dinner. It was after the dinner that father told me what little he knew about him. He had been born in the working class, though he was a descendant of the old line of Everhards that for over 200 years had lived in America. Note: the distinction between being native-born and foreign-born was sharp and invidious in those days. At 10 years of age, he had gone to work in the mills, and later he served his apprenticeship and became a horseshoer. He was self-educated, had taught himself German and French, and at that time was earning a meager living by translating scientific and philosophical works for a struggling socialist publishing house in Chicago. Also, his earnings were added to by the royalties from the small sales of his own economic and philosophic works. This much I learned of him before I went to bed, and I lay long awake listening in memory to the sound of his voice. I grew frightened at my thoughts. He was so unlike the men of my own class, so alien and so strong. His masterfulness delighted me and terrified me, for my fancies wantonly roved until I found myself considering him as a lover, as a husband. I had always heard that the strength of men was an irresistible attraction to women, but he was too strong. "No, no," I cried out. "It is impossible, absurd." And on the morrow I awoke to find in myself a longing to see him again. I wanted to see him mastering men in discussion, the war note in his voice. To see him, in all his certitude and strength, shattering their complacency, shaking them out of their ruts of thinking. What if he did swashbuckle? To use his own phrase, it worked. It produced effects. And besides, his swashbuckling was a fine thing to see. It stirred one like the onset of battle. Several days passed during which I read Ernest's books, borrowed from my father. His written word was as his spoken word, clear and convincing. It was its absolute simplicity that convinced even while one continued to doubt. He had the gift of lucidity. He was the perfect expositor. Yet, in spite of his style, there was much that I did not like. He laid too great a stress on what he called the class struggle, the antagonism between labor and capital, the conflict of interest. Father reported with glee Dr. Hammerfield's judgment of Ernest, which was to the effect that he was "an insolent young puppy made bumptious by little and very inadequate learning." Also, Dr. Hammerfield declined to meet Ernest again. But Bishop Morehouse turned out to have become interested in Ernest and was anxious for another meeting. "A strong young man," he said, "and very much alive, but he is too sure, too sure." Ernest came one afternoon with father. The bishop had already arrived, and we were having tea on the veranda. Ernest's continued presence in Berkeley, by the way, was accounted for by the fact that he was taking special courses in biology at the university, and also that he was hard at work on a new book entitled Philosophy and Revolution. Note: this book continued to be secretly printed throughout the 3 centuries of the Iron Heel. There are several copies of various editions in the National Library of Ardis. The veranda seemed suddenly to have become small when Ernest arrived. Not that he was so very large, he stood only 5 feet 9 inches, but that he seemed to radiate an atmosphere of largeness. As he stopped to meet me, he betrayed a certain slight awkwardness that was strangely at variance with his bold-looking eyes and his firm, sure hand that clasped for a moment in greeting. And in that moment his eyes were just as steady and sure. There seemed a question in them this time, and as before he looked at me overlong. "I've been reading your working-class philosophy," I said, and his eyes lighted in a pleased way. "Of course," he answered. "You took into consideration the audience to which it was addressed." "I did, and it is because I did that I have a quarrel with you," I challenged. "I, too, have a quarrel with you, Mr. Everhard," Bishop Morehouse said. Ernest shrugged his shoulders whimsically and accepted a cup of tea. The bishop bowed and gave me precedence. "You foment class hatred," I said. "I consider it wrong and criminal to appeal to all that is narrow and brutal in the working class. Class hatred is antisocial, and it seems to me anti-socialistic." "Not guilty," he answered. "Class hatred is neither in the text nor in the spirit of anything I have ever written." "Ah!" I cried reproachfully, and reached for his book and opened it. He sipped his tea and smiled at me while I ran over the pages. "Page 132, I read aloud. "The class struggle, therefore, presents itself in the present stage of social development between the wage-paying and the wage-paid classes." I looked at him triumphantly. "No mention there of class hatred," he smiled back. "But," I answered, "you say class struggle." "A different thing from class hatred," he replied. "And believe me, we foment no hatred. We say that the class struggle is a law of social development. We are not responsible for it. We do not make the class struggle. We merely explain it, as Newton explained gravitation. We explain the nature of the conflict of interest that produces the class struggle." "But there should be no conflict of interest," I cried. "I agree with you heartily," he answered. "That is what we socialists are trying to bring about, the abolition of the conflict of interest. Pardon me, let me read an extract." He took his book and turned back several pages. "Page 126. The cycle of class struggles which began with the dissolution of rude tribal communism and the rise of private property will end with the passing of private property in the means of social existence." "But I disagree with you," the bishop interposed, his pale, ascetic face betraying by a faint glow the intensity of his feelings. "Your premise is wrong. There is no such thing as a conflict of interest between labor and capital, or rather there ought not to be." "Thank you," Ernest said gravely. "By that last statement you have given me back my premise." "But why should there be a conflict?" the bishop demanded warmly. Ernest shrugged his shoulders. "Because we are so made, I guess." "But we are not so made," cried the other. "Are you discussing the ideal man?" Ernest asked. unselfish and godlike and so few in numbers as to be practically non-existent? Or are you discussing the common and ordinary average man?" "The common and ordinary man," was the answer. "Who is weak and fallible, prone to error?" Bishop Morehouse nodded. "And petty and selfish?" Again he nodded. "Watch out," Ernest warned. "I said selfish." "Well, the average man is selfish," the bishop affirmed valiantly. "Wants all he can get, true but deplorable." "Then I've got you." Ernest's jaw snapped like a trap. "Let me show you. Here is a man who works on the street railways." "He couldn't work if it weren't for capital," the bishop interrupted. "True, and you will grant that capital would perish if there were no labor to earn the dividends." The bishop was silent. "Won't you?" Ernest insisted. The bishop nodded. "Then our statements cancel each other," Ernest said in a matter-of-fact tone. "And we are where we were. Now to begin again. The working men on the street railway furnish the labor. The stockholders furnish the capital. By the joint effort of the working men and the capital, money is earned." Note: in those days, groups of predatory individuals controlled all the means of transportation, and for the use of same levied toll upon the public. "Very good," the bishop interposed, "and there is no reason that the division should not be amicable." "You have already forgotten what we had agreed upon," Ernest replied. "We agreed that the average man is selfish. He is the man that is. You have gone up in the air and are arranging a division between the kind of men that ought to be, but are not. But to return to the earth, the working man, being selfish, wants all he can get in the division. The capitalist, being selfish, wants all he can get in the division. When there is only so much of the same thing, and when two men want all they can get out of the same thing, there is a conflict of interest between labor and capital. And it is an irreconcilable conflict. As long as working men and capitalists exist, they will continue to quarrel over the division. If you were in San Francisco this afternoon, you'd have to walk. There isn't a streetcar running." "Another strike?" the bishop queried with alarm. Note: these quarrels were very common in those irrational and anarchic times. Sometimes the laborers refused to work. Sometimes the capitalists refused to let the laborers work. In the violence and turbulence of such disagreements, much property was destroyed and many lives lost. All this is inconceivable to us, as inconceivable as another custom of that time, namely the habit the men of the lower classes had of breaking the furniture when they quarreled with their wives. "Yes, they're quarreling over the division of the earnings of the street railways." Bishop Morehouse became excited. "It is wrong," he cried. "It is so short-sighted on the part of the working men. How can they hope to keep our sympathy?" "When we are compelled to walk," Ernest said slyly. But Bishop Morehouse ignored him and went on. "Their outlook is too narrow. Men should be men, not brutes. There will be violence and murder now, and sorrowing widows and orphans. Capital and labor should be friends. They should work hand in hand to their mutual benefit." "Ah, now you are up in the air again," Ernest remarked dryly. "Come back to earth. Remember, we agreed that the average man is selfish." "But he ought not to be," the bishop cried. "And there I agree with you," was Ernest's rejoinder. "He ought not to be selfish, but he will continue to be selfish as long as he lives in a social system that is based on pig ethics." The bishop was aghast, and my father chuckled. "Yes, pig ethics," Ernest went on remorselessly. "That is the meaning of the capitalist system. And that is what your church is standing for, what you are preaching for every time you get up in the pulpit. Pig ethics. There is no other name for it." Bishop Morehouse turned appealingly to my father, but he laughed and nodded his head. "I'm afraid Mr. Everhard is right," he said. "Laissez-faire, the let-alone policy of each for himself and devil take the hindmost. As Mr. Everhard said the other night, the function you churchmen perform is to maintain the established order of society, and society is established on that foundation." "But that is not the teaching of Christ!" cried the bishop. "The church is not teaching Christ these days," Ernest put in quickly. "That is why the working men will have nothing to do with the church. The church condones the frightful brutality and savagery with which the capitalist class treats the working class." "The church does not condone it," the bishop objected. "The church does not protest against it," Ernest replied. "And insofar as the church does not protest, it condones. For remember, the church is supported by the capitalist class." "I had not looked at it in that light," the bishop said naively. "You must be wrong. I know that there is much that is sad and wicked in this world. I know that the church has lost what you call the proletariat." Note: Proletariat, derived originally from the Latin proletari, the name given in the census of Servius Tullius to those who were of value to the state only as the rearers of offspring, proles. In other words, they were of no importance either for wealth or position or exceptional ability. "You never had the proletariat," Ernest cried. "The proletariat has grown up outside the church and without the church." "I do not follow you," the bishop said faintly. "Then let me explain. With the introduction of machinery and the factory system in the latter part of the 18th century, the great mass of the working people was separated from the land. The old system of labor was broken down. The working people were driven from their villages and herded in factory towns. The mothers and children were put to work at the new machines. Family life ceased. The conditions were frightful. It is a tale of blood." I know," Bishop Morehouse interrupted with an agonized expression on his face. "It was terrible, but it occurred a century and a half ago." "And there, a century and a half ago, originated the modern proletariat," Ernest continued, "and the church ignored it. While a slaughterhouse was made of the nation by the capitalists, the church was dumb. It did not protest as today it does not protest. As Austin Lewis says, speaking of that time, those to whom the command, 'Feed my lambs,' had been given, saw those lambs sold into slavery and worked to death without a protest. The church was dumb then, and before I go on, I want you either flatly to agree with me or flatly to disagree with me. Was the church dumb then?" Note: Austin Lewis was candidate for governor of California on the socialist ticket in the fall election of 1906 Christian era. An Englishman by birth, a writer of many books on political economy and philosophy, and one of the socialist leaders of the times. Note: There is no more horrible page in history than the treatment of the child and women slaves in the English factories in the latter half of the 18th century of the Christian era. In such industrial hells arose some of the proudest fortunes of that day. Bishop Morehouse hesitated. Like Dr. Hammerfield, he was unused to this fierce infighting, as Ernest called it. "The history of the 18th century is written," Ernest prompted. "If the church was not dumb, it will be found not dumb in the books." "I am afraid the church was dumb," the bishop confessed. "And the church is dumb today." "There I disagree," said the bishop. Ernest paused, looking at him searchingly, and accepted the challenge. "All right," he said. "Let us see. In Chicago, there are women who toil all the week for 90 cents. Has the church protested?" "This is news to me," was the answer. 90 cents per week. It's horrible." "Has the church protested?" Ernest insisted. "The church does not know." The bishop was struggling hard. "Yet the command to the church was, 'Feed my lambs,'" Ernest sneered. And then the next moment, "Pardon my sneer, Bishop, but can you wonder that we lose patience with you? When have you protested to your capitalistic congregations at the working of children in the southern cotton mills? Children, 6 and 7 years of age, working every night at 12-hour shifts. They never see the blessed sunshine. They die like flies. The dividends are paid out of their blood, and out of the dividends magnificent churches are builded in New England, wherein your kind preaches pleasant platitudes to the sleek, full-bellied recipients of those dividends." Note: Everhard might have drawn a better illustration from the Southern Church's outspoken defense of chattel slavery prior to what is known as the War of the Rebellion. Several such illustrations culled from the documents of the times are here appended. In 1835 A.D., the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church resolved that slavery is recognized in both the Old and the New Testaments and is not condemned by the authority of God. The Charleston Baptist Association issued the following in an address in 1835 A.D. "The right of masters to dispose of the time of their slaves has been distinctly recognized by the Creator of all things, who is surely at liberty to vest the right of property over any object whomsoever he pleases." The Reverend E.D. Simon, Doctor of Divinity and professor in the Randolph-Macon Methodist College of Virginia, wrote, "Extracts from Holy Writ unequivocally assert the right of property in slaves, together with the usual incidents to that right. The right to buy and sell is clearly stated. Upon the whole, then, whether we consult the Jewish policy instituted by God himself, or the uniform opinion and practice of mankind in all ages, or the injunctions of the New Testament and the moral law, we are brought to the conclusion that slavery is not immoral. Having established the point that the first African slaves were legally brought into bondage, the right to detain their children in bondage follows as an indispensable consequence. Thus we see that the slavery that exists in America was founded in right. It is not at all remarkable that this same note should have been struck by the Church a generation or so later in relation to the defense of capitalistic property. In the Great Museum at Asgard, there is a book entitled Essays in Application, written by Henry van Dyke. The book was published in 1905 of the Christian era. From what we can make out, Van Dyke must have been a churchman. The book is a good example of what Everhard would have called bourgeois thinking. Note the similarity between the utterance of the Charleston Baptist Association quoted above and the following utterance of Van Dyke 70 years later. The Bible teaches that God owns the world. He distributes to every man according to his own good pleasure, conformably to general laws. I did not know, the bishop murmured faintly. His face was pale, and he seemed suffering from nausea. Then you have not protested. The bishop shook his head. Then the church is dumb today, as it was in the 18th century? The bishop was silent, and for once Ernest forbore to press the point. And do not forget, whenever a churchman does protest, that he is discharged. I hardly think that is fair, was the objection. Will you protest? Ernest demanded. Show me evils such as you mention in our own community, and I will protest. I'll show you, Ernest said quietly. I'm at your disposal. I will take you on a journey through hell. And I shall protest. The bishop strained himself in his chair, and over his gentle face spread the harshness of the warrior. The church shall not be dumb. You will be discharged, was the warning. I shall prove the contrary, was the retort. I shall prove, if what you say is so, that the church has erred through ignorance. And, furthermore, I hold that whatever is horrible in industrial society is due to the ignorance of the capitalist class. It will mend all that is wrong as soon as it receives the message, and this message it shall be the duty of the church to deliver. Ernest laughed. He laughed brutally, and I was driven to the bishop's defense. Remember, I said, you see but one side of the shield. There is much good in us, though you give us credit for no good at all. Bishop Morehouse is right. The industrial wrong, terrible as you say it is due to ignorance. The divisions of society have become too widely separated. The wild Indian is not so brutal and savage as the capitalist class, he answered. And in that moment I hated him. You do not know us, I answered. We are not brutal and savage. Prove it, he challenged. How can I prove it? To you? I was growing angry. He shook his head. I do not ask you to prove it to me. I ask you to prove it to yourself. I know, I said. You know nothing, was his rude reply. There, children, Father said soothingly. I don't care, I began indignantly, but Ernest interrupted. I understand you have money, or your father has, which is the same thing, money invested in the Sierra Mills. What has that to do with it? I cried. Nothing much, he began slowly, except that the gown you wear is stained with blood. The food you eat is a bloody stew. The blood of little children and of strong men is dripping from your very roof beams. I can close my eyes now and hear it drip, drop, all about me. And suiting the action to the words, he closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. I burst into tears of mortification and hurt vanity. I'd never been so brutally treated in my life. Both the bishop and my father were embarrassed and perturbed. They tried to lead the conversation away into easier channels, but Ernest opened his eyes, looked at me, and waved them aside. His mouth was stern and his eyes too, and in the latter there was no glint of laughter. What he was about to say, what terrible castigation he was going to give me, I never knew. For at that moment a man, passing along the sidewalk, stopped and glanced in at us. He was a large man, poorly dressed, and on his back was a great load of rattan and bamboo stands, chairs, and screens. He looked at the house as if debating whether or not he should come in and try to sell some of his wares. That man's name is Jackson, Ernest said. With that strong body of his, he should be at work and not peddling, I answered curtly. Note, in that day there were many thousands of these poor merchants called peddlers. They carried their whole stock in trade from door to door. It was a most wasteful expenditure of energy. Distribution was as confused and irrational as the whole general system of society. "Notice the sleeve of his left arm," Ernest said gently. I looked and saw that the sleeve was empty. "It was some of the blood from that arm that I heard dripping from your roof beams," Ernest said with continued gentleness. "He lost his arm in the Sierra Mills, and like a broken-down horse, you turned him out on the highway to die. When I say you, I mean the superintendent and the officials that you and the other stockholders pay to manage the mills for you. It was an accident. It was caused by his trying to save the company a few dollars. The toothed drum of the picker caught his arm. He might have let the small flint that he saw in the teeth go through. It would have smashed out a double row of spikes, but he reached for the flint, and his arm was picked and clawed to shreds from the fingertips to the shoulder. It was at night. The mills were working overtime. They paid a fat dividend that quarter. Jackson had been working many hours, and his muscles had lost their resiliency and snap. They made his movements a bit slow. That was why the machine caught him. He had a wife and 3 children. "And what did the company do for him?" I asked. "Nothing. Oh, yes, they did do something. They successfully fought the damage suit he brought when he came out of hospital. The company employs very efficient lawyers, you know." "You have not told the whole story," I said with conviction, "or else you do not know the whole story. Maybe the man was insolent." "Insolent? Ha, ha." His laughter was Mephistophelian. "Great God! Insolent! And with his arm chewed off! Nevertheless, he was a meek and lowly servant, and there is no record of his having been insolent." "But the courts," I urged. "The case would not have been decided against him had there been no more to the affair than you have mentioned." "Colonel Ingram is leading counsel for the company. He is a shrewd lawyer." Ernest looked at me intently for a moment and then went on. "I'll tell you what you do, Miss Cunningham. You investigate Jackson's case." I had already determined to, I said coldly. "All right." He beamed good-naturedly. "And I'll tell you where to find him. But I tremble for you when I think of all you are to prove by Jackson's arm." And so it came about that both the Bishop and I accepted Ernest's challenges. They went away together, leaving me smarting with a sense of injustice that had been done to me and my class. The man was a beast. I hated him then, and consoled myself with the thought that his behavior was what was to be expected from a man of the working class. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Matt Saw, Montreal, mattsaw.org.